Our next speaker has worked on games like Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor, Elder Scrolls Online, Call of Duty Black Ops, and Singularity. He's here to talk about the importance of impact feedback for NPCs and player characters. Please give a warm welcome to Mike Jungbluth.
All right, I hope everyone had some good lunch. Right, so I'm Mike Jungbluth, and I'm actually really super excited to be here at Konsoll this year. There we are. So a little bit about me. I've been in the industry now for over 10 years. My last 2 years, I've been at Volition working on Agents of Mayhem. Before that, I've worked at a handful of other studios on a range of different games. And while all of them featured a variety of characters, the major way that they really interacted with the world was as betrayed by these covers through combat. Shooting, punching, kicking, slashing, all the things having to do with one character inflicting damage upon another character. And these verbs about attacking have really dominated much of my career. While other verbs like running or jumping have luckily been a large part of it as well, it always seems to be combat that becomes the core of the gameplay experience. And it should honestly be no surprise why. Combat is such an inherently deep system that carries a lot of player expectations. It really can't help but take over the other systems in your game. It's loud, it's demanding. So right out of the gate, my first tip for traditional combat in your game is don't do it. Just don't add it to your game. I mean, unless you really want to spend the majority of your development time on combat and make it the primary way the player interacts with the world, just find another set of actions. Find another set of verbs. Not sure what those could be? Well, you know what, since I'm just going to be talking about combat for the next hour, you have my permission to get up, go out, enjoy the world, see what you can find, explore, come up with these new actions and verbs. I'm not going to hold it against you. Just make sure you're back here in time for Matt's talk, because I don't want people to be out there exploring new verbs and actions and miss what he has to say. So then, why is it that if I'm advocating against combat that I'm going to do a talk about it? Especially when I usually like to talk about how animation and game design can influence character behavior and personality in new ways. Well, I wanted to give a talk that would be a deep dive, a sort of dissection on a specific aspect of game animation and within a game mechanic and how animation influences that. And since combat is something that most games have and is something that many are interested in, as last night seeing people swing swords and axes into clay betrays here, we might as well do it right. And one area that doesn't get nearly enough attention when it comes to combat is hit reactions. Everyone always focuses on how cool and responsive the player's attack animations are. And while that's definitely super important, it doesn't matter how cool or how powerful an attack looks if the result isn't equally impactful. It just isn't going to feel good. And like everything, when it comes to a demanding and deep system, even something that looks relatively straightforward, when slowed down and examined, usually betrays a much more complex series of events going on. So I want to look at that, the moment of impact. When the energy of one person's attack transfers to the other, how we replicate everything going on in a fraction of a second. Well, of course, beyond making every hit go into slow motion and using some ridiculous face deformation technology, which I know all of you have access to, but we're just going to try and do something else this time. Because, in all honesty, we don't need that, right? But what we do need is a lot of different parts of the game to be involved in the moment. We need the enemy character, the player character, animation, VFX, audio, UI. All of these make or break how good your game feels during the moment of impact. And just like when we go from seeing a hit in real time to when we slow it down, this can get a lot more complex than you might expect. So let's break down how each one of these should react at the moment. And I'll talk about how to not only go all out with each of these aspects, but what the bare minimum is going to need to be so that you can get better feeling hit reactions. But before we can do that, it's time for combat tip number 2. Know the style of the game you're making. Style can define a lot of which of these things you're going to need and how far you can take them in your game. The heart of this talk actually comes from my time working on Elder Scrolls Online, where the style of the game made it quite a bit harder to convey the feel and the moment of impact. I'll specifically break down why that is later, after we've defined all the components of a hit reaction, but while going through all of these, always keep in mind the style of your game and how it's going to affect your ability to leverage any of these aspects. Okay, so the obvious place to start this dissection would be enemies, or to be more specific, the person or the character taking the actual hit. This is where 90% of the focus should be spent when it comes to the moment of impact. And since I would have to trade in my official animator card if I didn't actually start by talking about animation, we're going to start there with hit reactions. So the first time I had to animate a hit reaction, I did what any self-respecting animator does, and I checked out the Animator Survival Kit, which is a great book if you haven't read it before. And right there on page 280, I was sure of it. I believed it had just given me the answer to what I need. Don't show the point of contact, just knock them right back out instantly. Just chop out those frames. It works in film. But this was one of the first times I learned that what works in film doesn't always work in games. So to see what I mean, let's look at what goes into a hit reaction animation. Here's some reactions I did back on the Hulk, which was like 9 years ago, and looking at a 9-year-old animation is always a little painful, but I still think the moment of impact on these is pretty successful, and here's why. So frame 1 is just the idle pose, nothing too crazy here. But the fun actually then starts on frame 2. What we have going there is you'll notice that they're sort of leaning in to the action, right? And what's important is that instead of having them instantly recoil, by having them lean into it, what we're doing is we're creating the most amount of contrast possible so that we're sort of simulating where it is within the space that they could be taking the hit. We also know that there's probably going to be a couple frame blend, maybe 2, maybe 3, and we want to make sure that we're sort of getting them into a location so that when they do snap back, you're going to get that feeling. Then it actually isn't until frame 5 that we're actually going to have that recoil back, right? So in those frames that the Animator Survival Kit says, hey, just cut that out, no, we need those, right? With game animation, every single frame is important. So this is the approach there. So when we look at it again in real time, like the slow motion videos before, this is one of those feel it, you don't see it sort of things. And it isn't an exact science. Sometimes you don't want to start on the idle pose, but you can actually start on the contact pose if you have less frames to blend into at the beginning. Sometimes you want the recoiling all the way back by maybe frame 3 instead of frame 5. It all really comes down to the weight of the character, the amount of damage you want to convey, and of course, the style of your game. So now that we know a little bit of what makes an impactful hit reaction, the big question comes, how many of these are you going to need for your game? So the first place to start is directional hit reactions, right? If it's a 3D space, front, back, left, and right. Pretty straightforward, nothing too crazy. But even here, there's a lot of potentially hidden complexity you're going to need to figure out before you get in there and you start creating the animations. How far should they move when they get hit? How fast do they need to recover? Do we need light and heavy versions of these? What parts or regions of the body can take the hit? How many of these are you going to need for each? All of these need to be defined. If you're making a melee game, the minimum you're going to want to support is 4 directions for light and heavy versions, so 8 animations. If you're making a shooter, then you're probably going to want to add in upper body and lower body for a total of 16 animations. From there, you can add the head, which puts you to 24. After that, you just start making variants of each direction, starting with the most common areas of attack, most likely the body, and just like that, congratulations, you've fallen down the rabbit hole of never-ending scope. But hit reactions may actually be one area where quantity can outweigh quality. If your character rigs are close enough that you can get away with sharing hit reactions across all of them, then having more variety will lead to more reactive hits, which means they will more specifically react to the player's actions, which is what every system should really strive for. And by the very nature of hit reactions, they're meant to be a bit jarring and sloppy, so things like foot sliding or minor lerping can actually be acceptable. So definitely something to keep in mind with the style of your game. How many of these versus how good do each need to look. But then beyond just the standard in-place hit reactions, you're really going to want to take some time and think about your knockabouts. When you absolutely want to show how powerful a hit was, these are your go-to animations. Right away, though, metrics are super important to define with these. How far back or how high up they go, how long they stay down. These are going to impact the design, the feel, and pace of your combat a ton, so definitely remember to be working on prototyping these things with blocked-in animations before you spend absolutely any time making them look pretty. So knockbacks are a good first place to start. And they can give you a nice moment to put some extra flair into how the character reacts to the hit and specifically how they recover from the hit. Like hit reactions, leading into the hit on the first frame of these knockbacks will give you that extra pop. And like hit reactions, it's best to define the metrics beforehand, especially distance and for how long they're going to be locked into the animation before they can recover. So these are the knockback animations that we used for most characters in Elder Scrolls Online. Here we used it to communicate when you successfully blocked an enemy's heavy attack. Because they're essentially stun locked for a certain amount of time, what I like to do is I like to keep their head looking away from where they got hit until they've actually recovered and can break out into the next reaction if desired, right? So you're sort of putting their awareness into the animation and attaching that to the gameplay feel and the mechanic. For Agents of Mayhem, we use knockbacks to push characters back a variable distance, as dictated by certain abilities. So for this, we author a single animation in place, which, when seeing it in place, can look a little silly. But when force is applied to it, it actually reads pretty well. Again, right, keeping the head looking away from the time that the player's locked out of being able to actually move is important here, as it lets them know, okay, it makes sense that I can't get out of this yet. All right, so the next are knockdowns, which are a lot of fun to animate, but they can get a little bit tricky because if you're not careful, it can come across like maybe the character's dead, and now your players get frustrated because they moved on and then the thing got back up and killed them. So you want to make sure that the loop on the ground is going to clearly read that they're still alive. And that's if you're not going to just craft a whole knockdown get up into one specific asset. But breaking them down is actually really beneficial. On Elder Scrolls Online, we broke the animations for the knockdown into 3 parts. And this was valuable because it allowed us to tweak and play with the design metrics. Having the initial knockdown, the on-ground loop, and the get-up as separate assets meant that we could have different tiers of enemies stay down for longer or shorter amounts of time using the exact same assets. This can also be leveraged by different abilities, causing longer knockdown effects than others. All right, and then here are my favorite, knockups. These things are incredibly satisfying to animate and incredibly satisfying to execute when in game. Every time you have one of these in your game, your players are going to call out that these felt absolutely great. Nothing really just feels as good as seeing your enemy like fly up and through the air. It's like a home run of hit reactions. I love them. But again, complexity, right? These require 5 assets. You're looking at the initial knock up into the air animation, an in-air falling loop because games are never just flat ground. You've got ledges and cliffs and all sorts of things going on there. You're going to want a ground hit when they actually impact onto the ground, into the ground loop and then the get up. Now, if you're smart, you can actually then use the same on-ground loop as your knockdown and the same get up on your knockdown. So you're looking at 3 more assets instead of 5, right? Which is the smart way to go about it. All right, so once you figured out which of the knockabouts that you want, you're going to want to look into directional versions of these probably as well. But since they're obviously more time-intensive to create and not as commonly used as standard hit reactions, you can actually get away with only using a front and back. You don't need left and rights. And this is because for the left and right versions, you can get away with snapping the front or back version to whatever orientation the player is at, kind of based on the graph, right? So if the enemy's in the middle and the player character is anywhere in the sort of front hemisphere, you attack them, just snap them there, just orient them on the first couple frames. It's really not going to be too noticeable or too gross that those first couple frames are snapping, because the force that's coming out of that is going to be so satisfying that, again, like hit reactions, that little bit of sloppiness just helps to add to sort of that impact jarring nature. So what this ends up meaning is, if you're wanting to do these knockabouts, you're looking at probably 2 versions for 3 knockabouts, which will put you at another 6 per character. You can try just orient, like snapping the front to all directions. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Doing a full 180 to the back with the front doesn't always necessarily get you the results you want if you're going for kind of a higher quality of visuals. All right, but we're not done yet with the animations. Stuns are going to be something you are probably going to need to look at, most likely with bosses, because stuns sort of kind of be like a game design duct tape. There oftentimes isn't necessarily a lot of time or effort able to dedicate to bosses, so hit them 3 times with a thing, they stun, hit on them a little bit more, they come out. Next boss. But you're still going to want to use, or you might actually be able to get away with just using a loop of a knockabout as the stun, right? You could use maybe the knockback as the enter state, use the stun as the loop, and then have them come out of it. Again, if you've designed this as your metrics, you can totally get away with it. But you also might want to take into account the fact that different status effects, like being hit with fire or ice or electricity, might require new poses. You might be able to get away with just VFX, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. But again, this all comes down to how often you're using these things in your game. Because the more you're using something, the more you're sort of drawing attention to it, the higher quality it needs to be, right? We'll get more into that later, but that's something to always kind of keep in mind, right? The more of anything requires more of more. So definitely something to keep in mind with stuns. All right, so all of this stuff could potentially be a problem, though, depending on the design of your game. Because sometimes with designs, you may not want the characters to be interrupted by every single hit. And this is especially true on multiplayer games, right? There's nothing more frustrating than every single light attack stunning you. So what could potentially come up is additive hit reactions. And that leads me to combat tip number 3. Additive hit reactions are a half measure at best and sometimes a waste of your time at worst. The entire point of a hit reaction animation is to make the attack feel powerful. With additive, because you're trying not to interrupt the character being hit, you really only have the head and maybe some body rotation to sell it. And the result is probably going to look more like a weird blend or a hitch than a nice moment of impact. But sometimes you have to use them, so here are some best chances for success if you do. The safest bet, like we were saying, is just use rotation on the head and the torso. That should play pretty well with whatever's going on underneath, so that you aren't breaking the body too badly. So if they're swinging a sword like this, and you decided to do something like this, they start looking like those floaty arm people that just lose all sense of danger or purpose, right? You might be able to get away with some hip translation. If you have IK feet, that'll work probably a little bit better. Otherwise, they can start sinking into the ground or sliding really badly. Again, style of your game, that may not matter, but something to keep in mind. And even then, if you are translating, just translate them down. Down is safe. If you translate them back and then they're walking, you're going to get weird legs popping and ugliness will happen. So down is always safe. Up and back and never safe. You're also going to want probably shorter blend times in and much longer blend times out on additive hit reactions. So in this video here, watch the Naga character, the sort of snake character in the middle. What we're doing here is it's a 12-frame animation. We're doing a 1-frame blend in on the additive and a 12-frame blend out. So what this means is we get that jarring moment of impact at the beginning, but then it quickly starts blending out after only 3 frames, allowing whatever action underneath is to still be conveyed, right? So that you know, okay, she's still charging up for this attack. What this does is it helps to visually key that they're hit, but they're still going to come at you. The other approach to additive is to use procedural impacts instead of animation assets. So on Agents of Mayhem, we're lucky enough to have a pretty robust procedural system. And what we can do then is we can layer on bone rotation and translation over top of whatever action or behavior the character is doing. The beauty of this system is that we only need to author the procedural modifier once, and we can then use it across all characters instead of needing to author unique hit reaction animations for each character. The results are largely the same, but the cost creation is much smaller, making the value of using them outweigh the cost of making them. So here when you see him let go of the gun as he's being shot, that's a bespoke hit animation. Whenever he's like crouching and they're just kind of taking that compression, that is all the procedural stuff, right? So you can kind of see a difference between the two and how the two feel. And then through it all, with any animation, right? Remember, the personality of the character is always important. And you need to be able to inject that into the hit reactions as well whenever possible, right? For example, this was on Lord of the Rings, War in the North. This was meant to be a stronger character that could take more damage. So I like the idea that when he got hit, he sort of like laughed it off and kept coming at you, right? Added a little bit of a variety to him as opposed to the normal, took a hit and didn't even really care. All this is going to do is give you an opportunity to help make the character feel unique from one another without, stomping the design or anything else like that. All right, but animation's only one part of the hit reaction puzzle. If you want to continue to make it feel better beyond animation, or if your game isn't able to leverage animations as extensively as laid out, especially with you can only use additive, VFX is really going to be your next stop. I'm not a VFX artist myself, and I can't speak to the specifics of how you create these things, but these are the most common instances of how they're used in ways that we've worked on different combat and different games. So first, of course, is the moment of impact, right? And this is a sequence that was done by Paul Vier on Nuclear Throne from Vlambeer. And I really like this example because with the animations, he's actually creating extra pop in the first couple of frames by forcing that extra contrast, right, of the white and then the black and then actually the explosion as you'd expect it. And this is awesome, right? Because this is just like the hit reaction in animation where we're sort of taking those first couple frames to fake it, right? And we're trying to give you that most amount of contrast to really sell that moment. And anytime, you can see these principles sort of transcend one discipline into another, right? You start to realize that the creative process is the creative process, and what works in one can often work in a different manner. And then past that, right, the same way as with animations, adding in directional VFX to the impacts is also going to help further sell the specific impact. So we're going to return to that clip, And this time, instead of focusing on the characters, focus on the VFX animation that plays on the snake. When you hit the character from right to left, the blood VFX matches the direction the blade's traveling, right? So it's like this, and then the blood goes off the blade, off the character. And then the same with the reverse, right? Since the additive animation in these really can't convey the directionality, as well as if it was a full body interrupting animation, the VFX helps to layer in that impact. And like anything, once you start to shine a light on something as a core piece of communication to the player, additional depth is going to be required here as well. Having a robot use blood VFX may look odd if you're using VFX to sell impact. So you might need to have a version with sparks and oil. With a werewolf, you might want to add some fur to the blood. Just like animation, this is going to quickly bloat into a lot of extra work. So figure out where you can kind of go on the balancing act of more animation versus more VFX, and who kind of needs to carry the load of these things, and who can kind of share the load on all of these. All right, and then we've got UI. Selling impact just doesn't stop with animation and VFX. Another critical piece of the visual feedback is UI, right? These can get pretty gamey visually. So the style of your game is definitely going to help to define which of these you can use and to what degree you can use them. But when animation and VFX aren't cutting it, or you don't have the bandwidth to be able to spend on all of those unique assets, UI elements are going to be a system-wide solution that can just work on every character every time. So it can be pretty valuable that way. So we'll start with the health bar, right? Those are pretty standard elements in games. Most characters have them. And while the primary function is, of course, to communicate how much life a character has or has left, they can also be used to communicate when a player's taken a hit. So here we can see that the attack was successful, as well as how much damage it did compared to the total life bar, right? With the red versus the yellow-green section. But we could take it even a step further, and you can actually put an impact visual on the health bar at the time of impact, or even shake the entire bar at time of impact. What this will do is help to draw attention to the health bar, though. So again, you need to make sure that the style of your game is cool with having that much of a UI be the primary factor, and you don't want it so much a focus on the characters themselves. All right, so then damage numbers. These are another lifeblood that a lot of games depend on. Especially for games where you can't interrupt every single hit with an animation, these can communicate the success of the attack. Font, color, size, and movement can all be used to really great effect. They're also the most effective way I've ever found of showing an area of effect damage over time. Seeing all those numbers like sizzle and pop off of them isn't anything I've found another way of replicating, right? Just having the flames on them doesn't sort of give you that same sort of feedback. If they keep doing little twitchy animations, it doesn't like that. I just haven't figured anything out. If you do know something, like, let's talk, because you're a genius. So here on Agents of Mayhem, returning to this clip, you can see that we use color, size, and the movement of the numbers themselves to differentiate normal hits versus critical hits. Normal hits have white numbers that sort of effortlessly float off the character, while the critical hits have orange numbers that slam in a little bit harder and actually sort of stick to the character a little bit longer, so that they're further sort of selling that moment. All right, the next UI element that's important then is the reticle itself. We're going to return back to this clip again, but let's look at the reticle this time. And notice that on impact, it's going to flash red. Other approaches that games use, right, are a flashing dot or an X in the middle. You've seen this on tons of different shooters. Also notice that when the target is in range, the shape becomes a lot tighter in size versus when there's no longer a target in range and it opens up. That's another way of communicating that this hit is going to be successful when it goes off versus when you're just going to be whiffing through air. All right, next up are screen indicators. And these are going to cover a number of different things. Here you're going to see that we've got the blood on the screen type, you've got the blur and distortion, damage directional indicators. When you absolutely want damage conveyance to dominate pretty much everything else in the scene, this is going to be how you do it. But again, on your style, how far you can go with these things is really important. So we're going to look at this Agents Mayhem clip again, and you can see we're using the screen indicators in two ways. The first is the full screen indicator, which is the blue flash overlay that happens all around the corners and ekes in towards the center of the screen. And the second is the directional indicator, which is aligned to the front of the player. This is sort of represented as that shield icon so that you know where an attack was coming from. Yeah. And then there is the most video game method yet, hit flashes. Anytime a character takes a hit, just flash a bright color on them for a few frames. I mean, this isn't technically part of UI, but it has a similar form of conveyance and feel where we're less concerned with selling the reality of what impact is and more the sensation of impact. So as this clip shows with AOM, we're using hit flash along with pretty much every other UI element and animation element because our style doesn't require subtlety. So we can just go all out with it, which is great. Okay, so audio is, of course, really important to all of this and to selling impacts. I'm woefully unskilled at game audio, especially when there are some incredibly skilled people here. I'm just going to say, let's save that discussion for them some other time. All I know is that contextual is really important and that they're wizards, and if they would ever do a talk about how to sell good impact through audio, I would be the first one signed up because it's incredibly important. All right, but there are still then a few extra elements that go into making impact feel better. And these are as much about game feel as they are the visual aesthetic of the game. Camera shake is one of the most important elements you can add. There's a fantastic talk by Vlambeer's Jean Willem called The Art of Screen Shake. I imagine many of you have seen it. If you haven't, definitely watch it. If you have, watch it again. It's fantastic. It has a lot of overlap with this talk, speaking to sort of all of the elements that go into making combat in general feel really good. So definitely check it out. Okay, so returning to this video one last time, notice that for us, we have the screen shake on each successful hit. And what we even do is we sort of tug the camera in the direction of the attack itself, similar to directional VFX and directional hits. We also had light and heavy impact shakes available to the player. And the more of these features, again, you can layer on top of each other to communicate, the more they're all just going to kind of continue to build on top of one another so that it starts to sort of become this cohesive whole. Okay, controller rumble. Like camera shake, a little bit of this can go a really long way. I remember there was in Smash Brothers Melee, I played a 15-minute Melee. I was playing as Link. And I remember by the end of it, my hands were numb because they had like rumble on just everything. And I was like, I can't play anymore. This hurts. Well, actually, you just don't feel anything. They're numb. So, you know, I kind of look at camera or controller rumble like typing in caps. Every once in a while, when you use it on a word, it's impactful. When you use it on every single word, people just hit ignore. And ignore is the worst thing that can happen to your game. So, you know, maybe just put it on like knockabouts, kills, things like that. Okay, hit stop or freeze frame. This is a fighting and action game staple. At the moment of impact, just freeze the game for a frame or even a little less. And what it does is it sort of helps to highlight the moment, right? So here's a scene from Devil May Cry. They use it a lot. Even more than rumble and camera shake, you know, I think to do this well, you want to kind of feel it. You don't necessarily want to see it. I think there are some times where it's a little bit more successful than others, right? Again, style. Maybe your style is that when they hit, you totally freeze it for a good long time and you're showing a really cool pose. Style dictates everything with this stuff. But usually in a multiplayer game, especially an online multiplayer game, it's not going to work. We tried to do it on Elder Scrolls, and everyone is always so aware of lag. It hitches, and they go, why is it hitching every time I hit? Do I have a bad connection? Oh, this game can't even handle combat, whatever. So be wary of trying to put it into multiplayer games and your online games. All right, but that does lead us to the player attacks, right? Or the person that is attacking. How should they react to the moment of impact, right? And when hit stop isn't the solution. What works out really well are hit and miss animations. They're pretty standard fare in first-person games, and depending on the third-person game and the design needs of it, they can work out pretty well there as well. So what this means is, you author two separate animations. One is if the attack flew through the air, like in the top left, where essentially they didn't hit anything, and they're just swinging through with the full force of their body. The camera follows through more. It's obvious that they're just kind of whiffing and swinging through the air. Then what you want to do is you want to author a second animation that branches at the moment of impact. And that's authored to sort of look like maybe it hit on something, right? You're sort of maybe baking the hit stop into the animation some resistance. Also with the camera, you notice that it doesn't pull as far, right? So that it feels like maybe the character's locked on in place, as opposed to sort of just following the blade. And so there's more intent in what they're doing. So here are the misses that we have on Elder Scrolls Online. And in this version, I'm showing light and heavy attacks. And you can notice here, like with the first person, the weapon, the body, the head, all of it follow through the action completely, right? They're swinging it like a bat. And this taking their focus off of anything in front of them and committing to the weight of the swing because they're aware I didn't hit anything. And here are the hit versions that we initially shipped the game with. They're essentially just hit stop that was authored into the player animation at the moment of impact that was likely to happen when they're at the cursor. As opposed to normal hit stop, which freezes the whole game and reads like lag. By authoring it in there, the intent was that you still get that sort of visceral moment, especially since we weren't able to do full body hit reactions to help sell that feeling of impact. Again, head stays on the target throughout, and the swing doesn't follow through quite as much. There's a little bit more resistance and tension in the body. We weren't entirely pleased with how those turned out, though. So we did an update that came out about maybe a year after the game launched. And what we did here was you can notice that, again, the weapon has a bit of a hit stop, but what happens is at the moment of impact, instead of hitting and sort of following through, it sort of hits and repositions. And that reposition then becomes the anticipation pose for the next attack. So what it's doing is, again, it's signaling successful impact, and again, by always wanting to sell the intent of I just hit something and awareness of I just hit something, by leading to the next one, it says, I hit it, I know that I can hit it again. And it blends up into that next one. And we felt that these ended up being a lot more successful in showing intent and awareness and feel. All right, so with all of this in mind, why didn't ESO hits feel better? It might be a question you're asking yourself. That was something that came up a lot whenever we initially shipped the game and through beta and kind of happened. And it's a fair question to ask. And it's one that I toiled on for much of my time working for the game. And the answer in my mind is that, well, we were really put in a hard spot by our style. The style of the game was trying to be, was wanting to be a real-time action game, right? But the genre and visual aesthetic put a lot of constraints on us when it came to selling the moment of real-time impact. Specifically because player movement needed to be 100% maintained. We couldn't do full-body hit reactions that interrupted the character. Outside of the knockabouts. And those were the few times that people called out, hey, that felt really great when I sent somebody up and flying through the air. So even if we could have done full body, 16 animations per character wouldn't have really been attainable across that many different rigs and characters and creatures and things like that. And so that's not really a problem like in most games that are MMOs or multiplayer games, right? Because they go, well, okay, you can't have as much animation, let's lean on VFX and UI. But the aesthetic of Elder Scrolls is very much remove as much UI as possible. You want to be sort of in the world. And so that meant that a lot of the UI elements that could be system-wide weren't available to us. So what we shipped with was this. And outside of those knockabouts that people called out as feeling good, we still kept hearing it doesn't feel impactful enough. It doesn't feel impactful enough, which tells me even all of this might not be enough. Maybe something bigger, right, or something more could have helped. More recently, since I've left, they have added a couple other things, a second health bar and damage numbers to the game. So what those look like is the second health bar, I think, does help to convey the specific amount of damage and the moment of impact to a certain degree, because it's down there closer by the player's head. And it helps to make sure that you've got one more piece of feedback into that moment, right? They also added in the damage numbers, which, like I was saying before, certainly is going to help with like AoEs, getting that fizzle and pop when, there's nothing more satisfying when you're playing against like a bunch of enemies and there's a big mob and you drop it and they all start fizzing. This damage numbers certainly help that. I don't know if they help as much on the initial impact, but again, every little bit with these things is just going to continue to add on and help. But then, of course, a case can be made that they do start to potentially pull you out of the visual aesthetic and immersiveness of the nature of the game. So all of this in general, right, because there's a lot of stuff going in there, and it still doesn't always feel as good as it could. This leads me back to combat tip number 1. With traditional combat, just maybe don't do it, right? Consider cutting it or taking all of that time and resource and put it into another system, into another action, right? Because, this was just to get hit reactions to feel good. And there's a ton of stuff that has to go on across multiple disciplines. And that's a part of combat that no one really even necessarily spends a lot of time thinking or talking about, right? And because combat is so pervasive and well done in so many other games, the player's expectations are they're incredibly high on what should feel good in combat. All this is sort of what I like to call the uncanny valley for combat. If anyone's counting, it took me 77 slides into an animation talk to bring up the uncanny valley. But the genre of your game and the art style of your game are really your roadmap for staying clear of the uncanny combat valley. Because it's a deep, dark hole to fall down, and the slog to get out of it is nearly impossible sometimes if you aren't given the right gear to traverse it. If you're wanting one of those big action games, you're going up against the likes of God of War and Dark Souls and Devil May Cry. And if you've got the constraints of only being able to do additive or not being able to do a lot of UI things or just time and assets or synced attacks and all that stuff isn't an option, then without those, the tools to climb out of that valley could just be a little too immense. In terms of the uncanny valley of believable human behavior that people most know, this would be akin to trying to sell realistic facial expressions with a Muppet mouth. Now, there is absolutely nothing wrong with a Muppet mouth. The Muppets are awesome. But you need to be honest with yourself that you're making a Muppet and you only have the ability and time to make a Muppet and not a more realistic character. And when you admit that, it's going to save yourself a lot of heartaches and a lot of headaches later on. All right, I don't want to end on a down note. And since I super briefly mentioned them, let's talk about one of the most fun things in the world to animate synced attack animations. Adding these to your game will not only make it look and feel better, but it's also going to make every animator on your team jump for joy, assuming you've given them the time to do it adequately. Taking all of the standard elements from hit reactions still applies, but now you can really sell that moment of impact as well as the personality of the character in ways you just really couldn't do before. Something to always keep in mind when coming up with synced actions is who's the star of the scene or the sequence and who's the co-star. And this is a place, again, where knowing the style of your game is really going to be important. If you want the player to feel any sort of empathy, be it for a laugh or for a cringe, make the person getting hit be the star. If you want to focus on the physicality of the action or highlight kind of how cool something looks, then the person that's doing the attacking, that's going to be the star of the show. Here's one where I wanted the player to feel like they were powerful. So the spider really only exists as a secondary force. I mean, they're, for all intents and purposes, a ragdoll. And they're the co-star. And they're meant to support how powerful the dwarf is, the personality and the feel of this little dwarf being able to take out a giant spider. Here, because the player was meant to be more of a blank avatar that didn't have a whole lot of personality, I wanted at least a little bit more of a focus on the enemy. By allowing them to sort of linger for a little bit, and by exaggerating the moment of impact on them more than the specific pose of the attacker, the intent is to sort of empathize with them, at least for a little bit more. You can certainly push this more. Again, as a blank avatar, if the person's playing someone that's really brutal, then this might not work as well. But if they're kind of meant to be playing someone that just kills because they have to kill, but they're really a nice person inside, well, then this might work, right? So you kind of, with blank avatars, have to straddle the line a little bit and make of that what you will. And then here's an instance where you sort of have a conversation between star and co-star and a transference of roles. Starting the elf by them being taken over, I really wanted to contrast that with the spider's own reaction to being stabbed. So I made the spider at the beginning more of the star. It's not until the elf really pulls forth the blade and does that little kind of brushing off motion that it sort of takes back control of the starring role for a moment. But then again, I like to get that little bit of that little stumble of that spider back in there so that it kind of becomes the star again. Making sure that you don't have those things stomping each other is really important, right? Because then it's just people talking over each other. And while that complexity may feel like, oh, there's a lot going on, people want to see it a lot of times, people want to see interesting conversations a lot of times. They don't want to see people shouting at each other a bunch of times. And then when the final hit takes place, you've got a choice. Do you want bespoke animations or do you want to ragdoll them? The big difference is that ragdoll will usually elicit laughter, as we see, or a ridiculous sense of power. Bespoke animations can elicit fear, sadness, happiness, or awe. Essentially, it's a controlled versus chaos sort of scenario. Again, if you know the style of your game, making this should be a really easy choice. And like anything, the ability to use both is probably preferred and can be really beneficial. And then a quick tip when animating a death, specifically when they hit the ground and settle. First, one of the things we talked about was knockdowns can get a little confusing with deaths. Knockdowns keep the weapons in their hands. When they die, drop them. Once the weapon's out of a person's hand or a character's hand, the player knows, okay, they're not a threat anymore and I can move on. And then you can author as long and ridiculous a death animation as you want, and gameplay won't care because players have already moved on and they're watching if they want to and don't give any fucks if they don't want to. But when they do hit, something that's important is to keep in mind sort of the order of operations of how that force travels through the body, right? So, for example, right, you've got your elbow, right? You come down on your elbow and it hits. That drags your hand. When your wrist hits, right, that force pops your elbow up a little bit, which then also continues down with your fingers. Your fingers hitting pops your palm up, which drags your fingers, at which time the force of this has come back down, and you get that, right? Keeping that order of operations in mind is sort of a tedious but sometimes fun sort of exercise, right? And so whenever you start to author something and you get to that moment where they're about to hit the ground, you go, okay, it's their lower back hitting. How does this order of operations travel out through the body? It's their right shoulder hitting. How does that work? Keeping that sort of always in mind is really important because at that moment of impact, what you're really trying to sell then is pure weight, pure physicality, and less about the performance. So that's sort of the point where you go, okay, the person is no longer emoting. I just want to sell that feeling of weight. And then, like any animation exercise, though, doing that once is pretty fun. If you've got to do a bunch of them for multiple times, it gets a little tedious. So there is absolutely no shame in using mocap ever, especially when it comes to natural settles. Man, it just like gives it to you, right? It's great. Then I can actually go in and, as the animator, focus on the timing of the performance and getting up and adding a little bit of shake to the arm and sort of just plussing what's already there and not having to take all that time thinking about the physicality of combat on the ground. All right, so there you go. That's everything I know about conveying moment of impact 10 years on. And I always find it funny how something that is so small and often can be taken for granted, but it can still be so complex and important to the feel of your game. Though I find myself hard-pressed to really find any part of development that isn't like that. See, I've got about 3 minutes, and I could go back over what we just talked about, but what I think is far more important is lightning round. This is something that we did last year at the Animation Bootcamp at GDC during a Tricks of the Trade talk. That's free to watch on the GDC Vault, so check it out if you haven't. The idea here is to just toss out a lot of small bits of information that have sort of made a lasting impact on the way I animate or the way I approach things, and they don't really need to be long or dedicated to a single talk to cover it. So, all right, here we go. Let's do this. All right. At some point, you're going to be asked to make a very large character move very, very fast, ridiculously fast. And you're going to hate the request because of everything you've been animating with them. They've had a lot of weight and heft, and you think it's just going to ruin the performance and the feel of the character. But there's a solution here, and that's that you can move a character as fast as you need and as far as the gameplay and design request, no matter how ridiculous the speed, as long as when they get there, you have enough time to add the follow-through afterwards, right? So just let them know, yeah, I can get you from here all the way to over there, no matter how big they are. Like on the Hulk game, they wanted this big heavy dude to be able to dash like 15 meters. Fine. Can you just give us the extra frames once they get there to like sell that weight and overlap? Because when you do, you totally buy that person or that character can move that fast. It could be the size of a battleship floating through the air, and you can still get away with it if you've got the weight on the other end. Speaking of when they get there, you can use your jog stops and walk stops as just general move stops beyond what their name entails. For example, on Elder Scrolls Online, we used the jog stop that you see there as our dodge roll. And the beauty of this was that we could then end our dodge roll in the run pose. So if the player's still pegging the stick forward, they just blend seamlessly into the dodge. But if they stopped moving, you get that nice little bit of overlap, right, to kind of keep that momentum going. Whereas if we just had them come up and maintain that design metric of they need to be done within 30 frames, it wouldn't feel as good because they just kind of hit their pose and stop. Likewise, on Agents of Mayhem, we use our walk stops as our turn and play stops. Because we play directional jog starts on the beginning of the button press, we get that initial push off in the desired direction. But because we have 12 player characters in an open world game, we can't really invest in a ton of turn animations. What this does is this gives us that overlap, right? That feeling. We author in a few extra steps to kind of settle in place at the end of the walk stop, and it's not perfect. You get some foot sliding. It's not as great as if you had a dedicated system, but guess what? It still feels a hell of a lot better than just snapping and stopping in place. And it's no additional cost. This leads to my next tip. Ask and be open to everyone's feedback. Using the jog stop as a roll stop, that came from somebody in QA on Elder Scrolls. When I'm testing something in game and I want to know if it looks cool or weird to a non-artist, I'm going to ask a producer for their thoughts. Someone at QA became my go-to military person because she served in the Army for quite a few years. If you only ask the people sitting around you or in your discipline of how something looks, you're missing out on a vast wealth of knowledge. I think I'm out of time. For fingers, real quick, milk call. When you hold up your finger to or make a fist, it makes a ball. It doesn't look like this. I'm tired of video game fists that look like this, right? Like you ball your fist up. You get that curve. That's important. If you need to just quickly make a pose, just bring these two middle fingers together. Instant appeal. This is always going to look better than this, no matter what your pose is. And then finally, Milk Call. He draws the best hands ever. You just look to him. Facial expressions, you can always do more. I mean, don't ever stop with facial expressions. Figure out what character would be, what actor would be your character if they were to make a live action movie. Use this as reference. People are going to instantly grok what your character is about, who they are, and it's going to give you some really quick insights into where you can go with their personality. That's our main bad guy for Agents of Mayhem. Here is one of our player characters in Rihanna, I trust, as far as her face. And then keyboard shortcuts, always have more. If you've never run out of keyboard shortcuts on your keyboard, you're doing it wrong. They're going to save you time. If you even click something twice, you click it once, you've already sped up by half. All right, there you go. There is my Twitter when it pops up. Hit me up anytime to talk animation, character performance, new actions, new verbs, anything. Thanks a lot. It's been great. Hope you all had fun.